All right, let me clear some space here. Um, our group has really worked hard over the last few days and had a lot of good discussion. I think one of the things that makes it really fun to moderate a session or facilitate a session like that is to hear the ideas of this invited group and all the brain power that comes with it. And as I very unashamedly put it to them, I want to draw as much stuff out of your brain as I can because it will add to the richness of the report. So I do want to thank the group as well. I think we had some great participation. We started today really talking and setting the stage for the actions, where we talked about some of the management impediments and then some of the opportunities. As I framed it for our group, it was kind of like doing a SWOT analysis before you actually go into the actions. And I thought there was some good discussion along those lines too, and I briefly wanted to touch on that before we go into the action as well. There's a lot of discussion from the impediment side in terms of things like political fickleness and the need for politicians to have the backbone to uphold their own laws, and that becoming an issue. Certainly has recognized private property rights as something that can actually be an impediment. The fact that we just have tremendous regional variability. Our coasts, I think it was brought up yesterday with the sand comment. Maine doesn't have sand necessarily. Myrtle Beach we know does. But we have tons of variability. A coast is not a coast is not a coast. There's just a lot of difference, not only in the topography and everything else, but the social aspect and so on. There are one of the things that was recognized, I think, is a lack of skills, negotiation skills, and understanding the economic drivers of coastal development. I know I've seen it a lot in my career too, where we have folks that are permit officials and things like that aren't maybe masters of their craft. They may not have the experience or the breadth of knowledge to successfully navigate and to achieve maybe what the true community outcome is supposed to be. Coastal areas are a desirable place. There's no doubt about it. And it'll be interesting to see if the recent repetitive events on the coast actually change that mindset. Had a lot of folks talk about the fact that we just have this balkanized system of government, and agencies and entities don't have the incentives to think beyond their borders. And there's also then, as a result of that, really a lack of any kind of shared vision, any regional vision, any larger scale vision that way. In terms of some of the opportunities, one of the things I think that all of us in the disaster field recognize is that you can have lots of opportunities right after an event, whether it be for funding, maybe understanding of risk. Affected people hopefully understand better, although that isn't necessarily always the case. But also, we tend to have more precise data. We can collect high watermarks and do all of those kinds of good things that help then improve our management systems. One of the other opportunities, I think, is there's been a lot of progress in the area of whether it's forensic, hydrologic, and hydraulic analysis, and also the advances of technology with scenario modeling that we didn't even have maybe 5 years ago in terms of, there's plenty of areas that maybe haven't had a large storm in quite a while. I think at dinner one night we were talking about coastal Georgia and how much they're due for a storm. So you don't have any maybe good recent forensics that you can use, but you can use some good scenario modeling that. The old statement, there's power behind science, and we are generating science at a tremendous rate, even though there's some areas that we need to do. Using some old school things, high water marks, and the need for those, and perhaps that high water marks are an opportunity after an event, but also maybe an impediment that we ignore those kinds of things to help calibrate our models in doing that kind of thing. One of the things that came up, and this will come up in the actions as well, is the billions of dollars from the BP oil spill funding, and the opportunity to focus on Gulf Coast management issues and resiliency and some of those kinds of things. And then the evidence of sea level rise and how there will be opportunities to tap into that to sway public and political opinion. So when our group actually went into and talked about actions, I just did a little bit of tabulating, and I asked our group to individually come up with your top action. We actually collected multiple actions from folks, and we have that as part of our flip charts. But in terms of the highest priority actions, the majority of them fell into the policy area and the data area, and then we had lesser amounts in terms of the social and environmental, and a lot less in the research and the technology. So from the policy standpoint, one of some of these different actions, after a major flood disaster, our mitigation effort and programs are long, they're tedious, they're confusing, and we're missing a lot of opportunities. And so the action is to make those more efficient, more expedient, in order to take advantage of those opportunities and to lessen really the human suffering that's going on there. In terms of, we talked quite a bit about cost sharing and our different cost sharing formulas. One of the fascinating discussions, I think, and we had Nick from the UK in our group, so we got to hear a little bit about some other approaches, and where it sounded like the concept of a sliding cost share was actually tied to your BC analysis, in a sense. So, if you're going to only be at a 1-to-1 or a 2-to-1 BC, the cost share is going to be very minimal on the national part and largely carried by the community. But if you had maybe an 8-to-1 or a 10-to-1 benefit cost, then that increases. So I thought that was a very interesting part of the dialogue there. We talked a little bit on we need to continue to find ways to incent rebuilding, and that we still aren't doing enough to incent, so that there's still a lot of momentum and pressure to rebuild as it was before. Within our current our programs and those kinds of things. I think similarly, and let's see here, another person I think made a comment, is that really a $60 billion gift has been bestowed in the Sandy affected areas, and we should look at it as a gift more than really anything that's going to command a lot of change from a policy standpoint or good rebuilding. And that we need to change broadly our federal policy so that if we have such gifts in the future, that we have much higher, and not just a little bit, but much higher development standards, a much higher quid pro quo for those kinds of things, for that kind of gift, and getting folks to do the right thing to reduce impact to others. A more specific kind of discussion, but I think it was a person who had experience with FEMA, especially the public assistance programs, and those tend to be the high dollar. When you look at the portfolio, I think disaster assistance, that's where the bulk of the money is actually spent after a disaster. But there was a lot of energy related to NEPA, and I think energy and experience years ago, and training down to the operational level in the field, and that energy is waning. There's a large number of coastal projects that could have been influenced to be better, but if not for good experienced folks dealing with NEPA and looking at good alternatives analysis and those kinds of things, and so that was a very specific area that is to build that capability, capacity, knowledge, and training. One of the things that was kind of interesting too is this concept of a few folks talked about maybe the bar is a little low on participating in the NFIP. You know, at one time, it was the goal of the country to get as many communities in the program as possible, but in doing so, you know, it's basically a half-page form and an ordinance, and you get in. And that we need to maybe have a few more requirements if you're going to take advantage of really what is a mitigation program. So, you know, one thought was, you know, a long-term management plan. It would be a requirement for participating in the NFIP, a long-term, like a coastal resiliency plan, or, and certainly in inland areas that could be adaptable that way. And there was another thought, and I think that tied to the NFIP participation in terms of doing some of those other kinds of things. There is also something related to the NFIP in terms of CRS and really emphasizing the use of the CRS program, especially in light of bigger waters and the insurance implications there. And then we also talked a little bit about that concept of public-private partnerships. You know, having systems, especially in the area of finance, we all know the debt and the deficit are going to have impacts for years down the road. And so, you know, do we have systems? Do we have innovative funding systems in place? Do we have a system, you know, working with even with community bonding, their bonding limits or their bonding rates, in terms of you know, tying that back to kind of the mitigative or adaptive actions that they're actually taking. In the data area, we had a lot of data folks in our group of data focused people, and I thought there were some really interesting things there. There were two recommendations that really talked about creating some databases and information systems. One of those was compiling the planimetric building stock data on the national level. So things such as having home elevations, age, and having it all accessible and in one location. There was also a call for nationwide inventory of critical infrastructure, and in addition to some of those building data, and have that available. And then there was a lot of discussion on these data systems, and to have, whether it's a portal or even some of these data and technology centers, but some place that actually takes a lot of this data and this information and makes it accessible to the practitioner communities across state lines, to very easily access those key data sets that are needed for the coastal managers. Related to data, but maybe even more so even in the technology, and this is I'll let some of our group folks explain this a little bit more, but there was recognized a need, kind of almost a different category, and that had to do with operational aspects of management. And it's not really policy, but it's how you operationalize the information that you have, and having these good, improved operational systems. And so you know, I think the example was an electric utility. You know, they have lots of operational plans and those kinds of things, but our operational plans and systems optimize in terms of using the data that's available, and then optimize from the standpoint of actually reducing the risk, reducing the losses, and doing those kinds of things. Post-flood reports need to be funded. Older post-flood reports noted to be hard to find, and I especially like that when I know ASFPM, we have that concept, I think, in our post-Sandy paper as well. We need to do a better job of advertising success. Success stories, even if they're done, they're hard to find. We had a very interesting discussion where we were talking about, you know, kind of post-Katrina. And it seems like in the floodplain management community, the real outlier is that these big events tend to drive policy changes. But Katrina, which is the U.S.'s probably most contemporary event that caused the largest number of loss of life, we seem to have very little to show for it from a policy standpoint. But I think it was Dave Greenwood pointed out that it seemed insignificant, but probably the rest of us didn't know this. The Federal Highway Administration, after Katrina, looked at all of these pancaked and collapsed road structures, and they sent out a directive nationwide that required, I think, the evaluation and upgrading of bridges to make sure that they withstand uplift forces, which is something that hadn't been required before. So again, it's an aspect, it's to our road systems, but when you think of the cost and the investment in those systems nationwide, that probably is a big deal. But very few of us even knew about it. And so we have to do a better job of not only doing the success stories, but even getting the word out to the practitioner community. A couple things on research is that, again, looking at the kind of the restore funds or the BP funds from the oil spill, maybe looking at areas of coastal resilience planning, adaptation strategy research, and doing those kinds of things as an opportunity created by that. What is the, one of the interesting research needs is what is the payback on sustainable design versus retrofit? So there's been a lot of research done in terms of, the cost effectiveness of retrofitting existing structures, but very little on just doing the right thing in the first place with newer structures. And then finally, on the social areas, I think much like Jeff's group, one of the things we recognized is, not only is the technology changing, but our younger generations are incredibly adept and different from the standpoint of how they take in information. I think Firas was giving the example that his 1-year-old can already see pictures and things on the iPad and kind of being familiar with that, and that television was not even an issue with either of his young children. And so, how do we reach out to those younger audiences? How do we reach out to the kids, to the teenagers, to the folks that are going to be our future decision makers? And we need to have some concentrated efforts to educate them and change the culture from the very beginning. Also, from the social environmental, we're not doing a good enough job crossing political boundaries, and coastal process certainly don't match political boundaries. But how do we adjust this? It was mentioned again that I think it was the BP funding has some of this covered in terms of there's some regional kind of planning and things that have to be done as part of that. And then also, related to federal programs, maybe helping shift some of those programs to take more of that regional or watershed type approach. Now, the caveat being in coastal areas, and we also recognize this challenge, it's hard to identify a coastal watershed sometimes in terms of the coastal aspect of that. So we did recognize that as a issue. And then finally, on the social extent, and let me see if I can find exactly how this was written, because it was good. One person in our group talked about bigger waters, and they said it's like chemotherapy, and it's going to fix a problem, but it's going to create certain pain for communities, and we really need to recognize this. And so from a action standpoint, develop a set of actions to deal with that pain for the communities. And it was Bill Neckerman, I know, and coming from an older state in the Midwest like Ohio or New York State, where you have river communities that settled in the floodplain, the entire communities are going to be there. They're going to be especially challenged under the insurance provisions, and we need to have some thoughtful approaches going forward in terms of how that affordability issue really plays out, so that we don't do things like I think Dave Greenwood in our group talked about, so that we don't lead to a collapse of the NFIP, let's make it more effective. So that's it for our group. My group, is there anything that I left out that was big you wanted to mention? Okay, thank you.